You know, there's something fascinating happening right now in a part of Africa most people couldn't find on a map. The Sahel, that band of semi-arid land separating the Sahara from the savannas, has become the deadliest terrorism hotspot on Earth. Not Afghanistan, not Iraq, the Sahel. And in what might seem like a cosmic joke, the countries most affected have spent the last few years systematically kicking out Western military forces and replacing them with Russian mercenaries who aren't making things better. What's up, everyone? I need to be upfront. This is complicated. Colonialism, terrorism, coups, geopolitics, tragedy. I'm approaching this as someone trying to understand a crisis in real time, not someone with all the answers. The situation is fluid, information is contradictory, and I'm still working through aspects of this myself. But I'll do my best to explain why Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger decided to kick out France and the US and invite in Russia instead. Here's what we're exploring. How did France go from liberator to so thoroughly despised that protesters waved Russian flags at their departure? Why did military coups sweep the region? What are Russian forces actually doing? And is it working? And what does this mean for a region now accounting for over half of all terrorism deaths worldwide? In January 2013, Al-Qaeda-linked militants controlled northern Mali and were advancing on the capital. Mali asked France for help. Within weeks, French forces in Operation Serval had pushed back the militants and recaptured Timbuktu and Gao. French soldiers were cheered as liberators. It looked like a textbook success. But in August 2014, France expanded this into Operation Barkhane, a regional counterterrorism mission across Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Mauritania, with about 3,000 troops. The goal was straightforward: help these countries fight terrorism and prevent the region from becoming a safe haven for attacks on Europe. France emphasized partnership with the G5 Sahel countries, claiming they were there to support local militaries, not occupy. Here's the problem. Barkhane failed spectacularly. By the time France withdrew from Mali in August 2022, the security situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The numbers are shocking. Political violence deaths in Mali increased 150% between 2021 and 2022. In Burkina Faso, deaths jumped 77% in the same period. By 2023, over 8,000 people were killed in Burkina Faso alone. In 2024, the Sahel accounted for 51% of all terrorism deaths worldwide, nearly 20,000 deaths since 2019. All of this happened while France maintained one of the most sophisticated counterterrorism operations in the world. Billions of euros, advanced technology, intelligence networks, and it got worse, not better. So what went wrong? First, France's approach was overwhelmingly military-focused. Despite rhetoric about development, they centered on killing terrorist leaders and conducting raids. But Sahel terrorism is rooted in poverty, weak governance, ethnic tensions, and climate change. In 2018, 5 years into Barkhane, the 5 Sahel states received only 10% of French development aid to Africa. That never changed. France allocated resources to fighting, not to addressing the underlying drivers that allow insurgencies to recruit and thrive. Second, jihadist groups adapted brilliantly. In the early years, groups like Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb held territory and fought conventional battles. After French forces proved they could win those fights, the insurgents shifted strategies completely. They embedded in communities, exploited local grievances, triggered intercommunal conflicts, and made civilian populations the center of gravity. You can't drone strike an insurgency that lives among the people and draws support from them. Third, French-supported local forces committed massive human rights abuses. Malian and Burkina forces, with French support, or at least acquiescence, brutalized civilian populations, particularly Fulani communities, who were stigmatized as terrorist sympathizers. In 2017 and 2018, French forces even collaborated directly with ethnic militias in central Mali and the tri-border region. These militias achieved tactical successes against Islamic State affiliates, but they also committed atrocities against Fulani communities. When this became public, France's credibility was destroyed. Many people came to see French forces as complicit in ethnic violence, and insurgents exploited that perception ruthlessly in recruitment. Fourth, France struggled with a fundamental contradiction. They wanted to restore state sovereignty while avoiding getting bogged down in endless conflict. So they prioritized quick counterterrorism wins over long-term institution building. They achieved tactical successes that never translated into strategic progress. They couldn't commit to the comprehensive, decades-long effort that might have been necessary, but they also couldn't admit the purely military approach wasn't working and pull out. And finally, the post-colonial context poisoned everything. France is the former colonial power in all these countries. Many people view French involvement through the lens of France-Afrique, the system by which France maintained control after independence. The perception is that France exploits these countries economically and treats African leaders like subordinates. In the popular imagination across the Sahel, people couldn't understand how France, with all its power and advanced technology, couldn't defeat what seemed like ragtag militant groups. Some began to suspect France didn't want to defeat the terrorists because an unstable Sahel served French interests. By 2019, a former Malian minister told French media that anti-French sentiment was at its peak, with people ready to blame France for everything, even the floods. A Burkina officer participating in Barkhane itself said, "France has shown an inability to fight terrorists." This is why the population is revolting. These weren't isolated voices. Anti-French protests became regular across the Sahel. When French forces killed 19 civilians at a wedding in March 2021, when they shot protesters in Niger in November 2021, killing 3 people, these incidents reinforced that France saw African lives as expendable. Images spread on social media. The narrative solidified. Despite all the partnership talk, France was still behaving like a colonial power. By the time military coups started, the ground was prepared. Barkhane had failed to deliver security, and coup leaders gained massive support by channeling this anti-French sentiment and promising new partners. The first domino fell in Mali in August 2020. Colonel Assimi Goïta deposed the president, and thousands celebrated in Bamako's streets. The justification: the government couldn't handle the security crisis and corruption. In May 2021, Goïta staged a second coup, consolidating his power. The pattern was set. Civilians couldn't handle terrorism, so the military had to take direct control. Burkina Faso followed in January 2022. Lieutenant Colonel Damiba overthrew President Kabore, citing the same failures. Protesters took to the streets, some waving Russian flags and calling for Russia to replace France. But then, in September 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré overthrew Damiba, claiming he'd also failed to address the insurgency. Once again, supporters waved Russian flags as Traoré entered the capital. Niger was the breaking point. In July 2023, General Chiani deposed democratically elected President Bazoum. Niger had been the last Western ally. France had military bases. The U.S. operated 2 air bases with 1,100 personnel. Niger was the largest recipient of U.S. military assistance in West Africa. When ECOWAS threatened military intervention, Mali and Burkina Faso promised to defend Niger militarily. This threat led to the creation of the Alliance of Sahel States in September 2023, a mutual defense pact marking a complete break with the West. And it's important to understand, these coups found genuine popular support. In all 3 countries, the causes were similar: mounting anger over insecurity and corruption, high confidence in the military, growing disillusionment with democracy that seemed to produce the same failures. People genuinely believed the military would do better. All 3 juntas made identical moves. They expelled French troops, Mali first in 2022, Burkina Faso gave France 1 month to leave in January 2023, Niger kicked them out by late 2023. Niger also ended cooperation with the U.S., leading to complete American withdrawal by September 2024. In January 2024, all 3 withdrew from ECOWAS. In March 2025, they even left the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. And crucially, as they pushed out the West, they invited in Russia. Enter the Wagner Group. Wagner was a Russian mercenary organization led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the catering oligarch turned warlord who died in a plane crash in August 2023, 2 months after leading a mutiny and marching on Moscow. Before his dramatic death, Prigozhin had built Wagner into a global force doing Russia's dirty work, where the Kremlin wanted influence without official military presence. Wagner had operated across Africa for years, propping up governments in exchange for natural resources. They arrived in Mali in late 2021, Burkina Faso in January 2024, and Niger in April 2024. They brought capabilities local militaries lacked: drones, heavy weapons, combat experience from Syria and Ukraine. In December 2023, they helped capture Kidal, a rebel stronghold France never took. When Wagner hoisted their flag on Kidal's fortress, it was deliberate propaganda. Look what Russia accomplished where France failed. After Prigozhin's death, Russia reorganized Wagner into the Africa Corps, under direct Ministry of Defense control. By June 2025, Wagner announced it was leaving Mali, with Africa Corps taking over. The transition removed Russia's plausible deniability. Now every atrocity ties directly to the Kremlin. And there have been atrocities. In February 2024, Wagner and Malian forces killed at least 20 civilians at a wedding, including children. A June 2025 investigation found Wagner had abducted, detained, and tortured hundreds of civilians in former UN camps. According to ACLED data, violence involving Russian mercenaries increased 81% after Prigozhin's death, with fatalities up 65%. Here's the crucial thing: Russia isn't solving the security problem any more than France did. Reported fatalities across the AES countries reached a record 7,620 in the first half of 2024, up 9% from 2023, 37% from 2022, and 190% from 2021. Burkina Faso has lost almost half its territory to terrorists. The brutal Russian tactics, indiscriminate killings, torture, ethnic massacres create exactly the grievances that fuel insurgent recruitment. So why invite them? Russia offered unconditional support with no lectures about democracy or human rights. They don't care if you're a military junta or hold elections. For rulers who came to power promising security above all, that's attractive. Symbolically, Russia represented a break from Western post-colonial dominance. The fact that the Russian approach is also failing became clear later, but that realization lagged behind the initial enthusiasm. Here's the fundamental paradox. The military juntas seized power, claiming they could provide better security than civilian governments. They promised to defeat terrorists, restore sovereignty, protect the population. They expelled Western forces that failed and invited Russian forces that would succeed. They formed the Alliance of Sahel states to coordinate efforts. And by every indicator, security got worse. The statistics are staggering. According to the 2025 Global Terrorism Index, the Sahel accounted for 19% of all terrorist attacks worldwide and 51% of global terrorism deaths in 2024. 5 of the 10 countries most affected by terrorism globally are in the Sahel. Burkina Faso remains the single most impacted country. Despite a 21% decline in deaths from 2023 to 2024, the country still suffered 1,532 fatalities, a fifth of all terrorism deaths globally. Niger saw the largest increase in terrorism deaths of any country in 2024, surging 94% to 930 fatalities. JNIM, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and Islamic State Sahel province operate with significant freedom. They control territory, impose blockades, collect taxes, run In August 2024, JNIM massacred approximately 200 people in Barcelona, Burkina Faso, possibly as many as 600. In September 2024, JNIM attacked Bamako's international airport and a police academy, demonstrating they could strike even the most defended locations. The groups have become more sophisticated. They've increased use of IEDs, rockets, mortars, and drones. They've expanded geographically, pushing south into coastal West African countries. They've diversified revenue through kidnapping for ransom, drug trafficking, illegal mining, and taxation. JNIM has made kidnapping a core economic model, targeting civilians with business or political roles across all 3 countries. So why isn't the military-first approach working? The answer is the same now as during Barkhane. You can't solve a political, economic, and social crisis through military means alone. The insurgency isn't sustained primarily by ideology. It's sustained by chronic poverty, weak and predatory state institutions, ethnic tensions, climate change making agriculture harder, corruption, and competition over scarce resources. Counterinsurgency theory is clear. You need military pressure on insurgents, plus simultaneous efforts to address conditions that allow insurgencies to thrive, improve governance, provide economic opportunity, resolve grievances, extend state services to marginalized areas, build trust between security forces and populations, create pathways for people to opt into the state system. The AES countries and Russia aren't doing any of that. They're doubling down on hard counterterrorism that already failed. Worse, their tactics strengthen insurgencies. When Russian and Malian forces massacre Fulani civilians suspected of supporting terrorists, they create martyrs and recruitment propaganda. When citizen militias commit atrocities, they validate the insurgents' narrative that the state is the enemy. When countries prioritize military spending while humanitarian needs explode and economies collapse, they fail to demonstrate any benefits of aligning with the state. The juntas face another problem. They came to power through violence and maintain power through repression, so they can't afford to appear weak. They can't admit their approach isn't working because their legitimacy rests on the promise they'd succeed where civilians failed. They're trapped claiming victory, while reality contradicts those claims. Meanwhile, Russia's commitment appears limited. Russia is fighting in Ukraine. Africa Corps struggles with recruitment. Reports suggest discontent among Malian officers wanting more professional partners. Russia offers weapons and mercenaries, but not comprehensive development assistance or economic investment. And the Sahel isn't a priority for Moscow like Ukraine or Syria. The result is a perfect storm: security deteriorating, humanitarian needs exploding, democratic governance suspended, economic development stalled, regional integration broken, and populations suffering the consequences. We need to talk about what this means for real people. There are 28.7 million people across the Sahel needing humanitarian assistance in 2025, roughly the population of Texas. Millions displaced. When Wagner and Malian forces captured Kidal, tens of thousands fled to Algeria. Côte d'Ivoire shelters 55,000 refugees. Ghana, Togo, and Benin host tens of thousands more. These aren't statistics. They're families torn apart, children in camps instead of schools, farmers unable to plant. In Djibo, Burkina Faso, people have lived under insurgent blockade for over 2 years without adequate food or medicine. Mass killings happen regularly from all sides: jihadists, government forces, Russian mercenaries, ethnic militias. These were already the world's poorest countries. Niger ranked last on the UN Human Development Index, and conflict made everything worse. Agriculture disrupted, markets non-functional, climate change intensifying droughts and resource competition. Healthcare and education systems collapsed in conflict zones. And the violence is spreading south. Benin saw extremist attacks double between 2023 and 2024, with groups establishing strongholds in border parklands. Togo suffered 69 deaths from attacks. Islamic State Sahel province is expanding into northwestern Nigeria. JNIM is pushing into previously unaffected areas in Niger's Dosso region. The insurgency is metastasizing across West Africa. The AES withdrawal from ECOWAS shattered regional coordination needed to stop this. There was at least a framework for sharing intelligence and managing refugees. Now, that's broken. Coastal countries face growing threats while struggling economically. Benin increased its military budget 12% in 2022 alone. Ghana's economy is in distress, according to the World Bank, making response harder. What we're watching is a potential cascade. More countries becoming conflict zones, more refugee crises, economic development reversing, democratic institutions buckling under pressure. Jihadist groups establishing presence from the Atlantic to areas near the Red Sea. A terrorism corridor extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The Sahel tells us something crucial about our world. It's a case study in the limits of military intervention. France spent billions over a decade with advanced technology and made things worse. The US provided massive assistance. The EU ran training missions. The UN deployed peacekeeping. All failed. This isn't unique. We've seen similar patterns in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya. Western powers keep trying to solve complex problems through military force and keep being surprised it doesn't work. Military force can win battles, kill insurgent leaders, deny territory temporarily. But it can't build government legitimacy, create economic opportunity, resolve ethnic grievances, or address conditions that allow insurgencies to recruit. And when you're a former colonial power, you face insurmountable problems. People view your presence through colonial history's lens. Failures are magnified, successes questioned, motives doubted. France never overcame this, and arguably couldn't. The Sahel demonstrates how rivals exploit Western failures. Russia didn't create entry conditions, France did by failing. But Russia was positioned to take advantage through influence operations and no-strings military support. The tragedy is, Russia isn't offering better solutions. Their tactics are more brutal and less effective. But the symbolic value of choosing Russia over France was enough. This pattern is global. Where Western influence failed or was rejected, China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran step in with different partnership models. Sometimes these work better. Often they don't. But the era of unchallenged Western dominance in the developing world is over. Countries have options and exercise them in ways complicating Western interests. The Sahel shows how climate change, conflict, and state fragility intersect. Increasing drought and desertification make traditional livelihoods less viable, increasing poverty, increasing armed groups' appeal, increasing conflict, further disrupting economies and displacing populations. A vicious cycle military force and authoritarian governance can't break. And it shows where terrorism is concentrating. And this is a shift most people haven't noticed. The Sahel has replaced Iraq and Afghanistan as the global epicenter of terrorism. Iraq's terrorism deaths fell 99% from their 2007 peak, down to just 69 deaths in 2023. Afghanistan, while still experiencing violence, is no longer the dominant hotspot. Meanwhile, the Sahel now accounts for over half of all terrorism deaths worldwide. For 2 decades after 9/11, American foreign policy, military resources, and public attention focused on the Middle East and Central Asia. But while we were looking there, the deadliest terrorism crisis on Earth emerged in a region most people can't locate on a map. JNIM and Islamic State Sahel Province have proven adaptive and sophisticated, building sustainable funding through kidnapping, trafficking, and taxation. They've embedded in communities, exploited grievances, and focused on building local power and territorial control rather than the spectacular international attacks that characterized al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The international community doesn't have good answers for this model of insurgency. So what are the options? Honestly, none look good. A comprehensive effort addressing governance, development, and climate alongside security would need tens of billions sustained over decades. But who's doing this? The West failed and left. China focuses on infrastructure for resources. The AU and ECOWAS lack capacity. UN peacekeeping collapsed. Negotiating with some insurgents might work. JNIM has shown willingness for local dialogue, but the juntas came to power promising military victory. Negotiations look like weakness. Protecting coastal countries through containment means writing off 3 countries and millions of people, which is toxic and might not work since insurgents are already expanding. An AU-led peace operation could avoid colonial baggage, but would take years to organize and face similar challenges. The AES countries would likely reject it as interference. The likely scenario? Continued deterioration. Juntas consolidating authoritarian control. Violence persisting or worsening. Growing humanitarian needs with declining aid. Russia maintaining minimal presence. Jihadist groups expanding. More death, displacement, and lost futures. The international community paying attention during spectacular attacks, then moving on. It's a grim picture, but we need honesty about where things stand. The Sahel is a story of compounding failures, of post-colonial states failing to build inclusive institutions, of development failing to address poverty, of military intervention failing to solve political problems, of regional organizations failing to prevent coups, of the international community failing to sustain attention on slow-burn catastrophe. And it's about real human costs. Millions of lives upended, families torn apart, futures stolen from children in war zones. It's about the changing global order and Western powers' limits. France, the US, and EU couldn't shape outcomes despite capabilities and resources. The alternatives, Russian mercenaries, military juntas, fragile alliances, aren't working either, except for authoritarian leaders maintaining power. What I think matters most is that we pay attention, understand what's happening and why, don't write off tens of millions of people, and keep asking hard questions about why interventions fail and what might work better. So, I want to hear from you all. What do you think about the Sahel crisis? Do you see paths forward I didn't discuss? How should the international community respond? What responsibility do Western countries have, given their colonial past and recent interventions? What can people who care actually do to help? Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.